Hello, property investors. Welcome back to another session with us on the utilities management, facilities management. Please continue to join us every 2 weeks as we just go through the journey of the headaches and the solutions for managing your properties from a facilities perspective. And what that includes really is like how to make sure you're keeping up with your maintenance, how you make sure that you're keeping up with the utilities management on the property, the management of contracts with suppliers, with contractors, with agents, with property managers. Those sort of things are super important that you start upping your skill set when it comes to managing your property. We're obviously on this journey from a first-time property investor, first-time homeowner, through to a property investor, growing your portfolio, getting to that point where you have a beautiful, massive property portfolio. And as you're doing that, you need to be stacking your skills. Some people might be fortunate that they're already at the top end of that journey. They're involved in some kind of organization that has facilities management procedures in place. But as a new property investor, you've got to start building up on this experience as you go. And the reality is the only way that you really learn these things is through experiencing them, through living them. And what we want is to make sure that you shortcut that learning as much as possible and don't make mistakes that other people already have made. So today our focus is around the idea of electricity management. And specifically, I want to talk about this as we get ready to go into winter. South Africa, we are very fortunate in the fact that we don't have snow winters in most areas of South Africa. And I suppose with the conditions at the moment where even if you want to call it the global warming conditions, is the seasons seem to be shifting a little bit more. So although we should be having a solid winter onset now, there's still these crazy high hot days that we're getting, depending on where you are in the country. So when it comes to managing your electricity, particularly during winter, I think it's super important to just make sure that you're putting in place proper procedures. We, at the moment, aren't going through load shedding. It's just before the election, so that might be a factor. But who really knows what the factor is as far as Eskom is concerned, that we aren't having load shedding at the moment? It might be a case that we've finally got on top of all of the usage, all the private players who are coming into the space who are providing solar energy and that sort of mix to the Eskom platform might be benefiting everyone, but we don't know. We'll find out, I suppose, in the future if we are going to go back into load shedding. But I do recommend being prepared for that element, because whenever we go into winter, it's when there's a huge spike in electricity usage. And there's two main culprits for that. Is obviously your geyser continues to go, but people tend to have a little bit of a longer hot shower during winter. And they're a little bit afraid of getting out of that hot shower, or even a bath. They keep topping the bath up, making it super warm. So that's one element that ends up affecting your electricity bill. And then obviously the heating side of things. So people will then be wanting to heat their houses, their rooms, their space. So they're a lot more comfortable. So obviously that's a big spike. The same happens at the height of summer when it's super hot. There'll be a little bit of an air conditioning spark that happens. But winter, I think, is a little bit more aggressive, and it's important that we start to look at ways to control that. So looking into that is obviously what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are putting in place solutions that reduce the expense of electricity and specifically electricity, but reduce the expense of heating of spaces, so of homes, of rooms, that sort of thing. So a very good starting point is making sure that those spaces are insulated, they're sealed up as much as possible. So you obviously don't want broken windows in your places. You don't want windows that don't seal properly. You don't want doors that don't seal properly. So you need to look at that sort of thing. Make sure that the doors are seated correctly, that there's no lost air. Where you can, a little bit of extra insulation in the ceiling makes a huge difference. So the idea here is trying to keep the heat in, as opposed to trying to reheat the space, and that heat is just getting out all the time and you're having to restart again. So if you're able to keep the heat in through insulation or solutions like that, the heat isn't escaping. You're not having to go through the expense of reheating that space. So that heat that you've already put into the space remains there for longer. So I think that's an important starting point. Okay. Also good to bear in mind that during winter, and I've touched on it in the past, people tend to keep windows closed, and that builds up the humidity in the space, the condensation in the space, especially in bathrooms. So a little bit of ventilation is important to allow those spaces to dry out, and that humidity doesn't create mold, damp issues in those spaces. So those are two things to start with, just to be mindful of. Okay. Then when it comes to the actual electricity side, I think the best starting point is obviously around what sort of elements you're putting in place to make sure that your property is as efficient as possible from a heating perspective. So there are some great products out there that allow you to heat rooms that are a lot more economical. They're not like these old-fashioned element style heaters. So that's something to look at. You're looking at your lighting. Is the lights, are you converting lighting to LED lighting instead of the old styles? So getting on top of that is going to help save electricity as quickly as possible. When it comes to heaters, there's some great gas heaters available. So that for me would be a starting point as opposed to the electrical heaters. The gas is a lot cheaper and more efficient. So that there's a bit of a benefit in doing that. And then obviously you can move that around. The big thing to bear in mind with the gas heater is that's generally an open flame. So you do need to have some kind of fire protection in place in your properties. And I would recommend that as a best practice anyway. Make sure that your properties have a fire extinguisher, and make sure that that fire extinguisher is serviced every single year. So if there is a worst case situation, someone can have at hand a solution to fight that fire. Okay, so I think that's a good thought process or good thing to put in place. Okay, what happens if you really don't want to have that expense of someone heating up a place? So obviously, when you've got tenants in your properties, you need to make sure that they're responsible for the expense. So this really becomes super important in the space where you're doing a rent value, also the rental cost for the tenant is inclusive of electricity or lights and water, that sort of thing. So if you are in theory subsidizing their electricity, you want to make sure that they are reducing their expense as much as possible. So there's nice tricks to deal with that. This also comes into play in student accommodation buildings. So where you've got a student renting a room, the last thing you really want is a student to default to putting a heater on and heating their room through that expense. You really do want them to look at putting a jersey on, having a blanket, that sort of thing. So they're not resorting to the comfort, sitting there in short sleeves and shorts and heating the room up so they're sweating, instead of them putting on a jersey, putting on long pants and being comfortable that way. So I think that's what you're wanting to train as a best practice with your tenants, with the students. What's a nice solution then when you're in that space is, instead of putting circuit breakers into those rooms or to those plugs in those rooms that are 20 amps or more, what you want to put a 10 amp circuit breaker in for that space. So what that does is it does two things. It prevents them overloading plug points with multiple devices. So obviously if there's too many appliances on that plug point, it's drawing too much current, that circuit breaker is going to trip. So in the same way, a heater generally draws more than that 10 amp circuit breaker can handle. So that circuit breaker is going to trip. It's going to be an inconvenience for that tenant, and they're then going to sort of complain to you, which then gives you the ability to go, hey, what appliances are you using? Oh, you're using a heater. Listen, we prefer you not to use a heater. The circuit breaker can't handle that load. And obviously that eradicates it, because every time they turn on the heater, it's going to trip that circuit breaker. The other major benefit of doing that is you don't know what appliance they are using. And if that appliance is in a bad state or it's not efficient, it's going to draw too much current from the plug points on the walls, or that socket on the wall, and you see that in some places where that socket is actually cooked, it's burnt, it's black, and that's from overloading that socket with a device like a heater that just keeps drawing, and that actual socket ends up overheating. So there's a huge risk of fire in that situation, but you're obviously putting in place a preventative measure. Having that lower circuit breaker makes a huge difference. But now for me, I really don't enjoy the idea of providing or subsidizing free electricity for my tenants. So the best practice for me in that shift is to put prepaid meters in place. Okay, so the tenant knows that they are paying for their electricity and they're consciously aware of what the expense is for the electricity. I suggest prepaid meter as opposed to your postpaid electricity meter, where you're invoicing the tenant after they've used the electricity, because what the prepaid meter does is it makes it real for that tenant today. So if they go and they put 100 Rand onto that meter and they use that 100 Rand on the heater in their room, then they're going to be aware and they're going to go like, oh, hang on, it's expensive to use a heater. So they're going to disconnect it. They're going to turn it off when they leave the room, that sort of thing. So they take control of the management of their electricity usage. So I really do suggest that route of a prepaid meter, because it's up in their face, they're conscious of their usage. Okay, and then there's obviously a lot more systems you can put into place, but it really is an idea of controlling the habits of the tenants. So I think maybe in the comments, if you've got any other ideas, drop those into the comments. It's well worth sharing with people your solutions that you've put into place, and any questions for the group, so people can obviously give some feedback in that space. What I do want to bring to attention is, at the moment, SAPIN-Prepaid look forward to seeing you at future presentations like this, and we'll chat soon. See you in 2 weeks' time.